In one hand, Thomas Hadley carried a leather portfolio worn soft at the corners from years of use. In the other, the small hand of a 7-year-old boy named Eli, who wore a striped green sweater 2 sizes too big and held a plastic dinosaur against his chest like it was armor. Thomas Hadley was 43 years old. He had worked in hospital administration for 19 years before. He stopped working for other people and started building something of his own. Calloway Regional Medical Center had been his idea, his risk, his 18-hour days and missed birthdays, and the single moment of clarity he'd had standing at his wife Claire's bedside 3 years before she died, watching the nurses move through their shifts with quiet dignity, thinking, someone has to build a place that treats people like they matter. He had built it. The building stood 12 stories high on the east side of Denton, Ohio. It had a children's wing on the 4th floor painted in warm yellows and soft blues, a free clinic in the basement that ran on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and a lobby with real wood paneling instead of the usual institutional gray. Thomas had argued about that wood paneling with the interior contractor for 2 full weeks. He won. The morning he walked in with Eli was a Tuesday. Eli's school had a pipe leak that had flooded 2 classrooms, and the district sent a text at 6:42 in the morning. No school. Thomas had a board meeting at 9. He had no one to call. His sister was in Cleveland. His mother-in-law was recovering from knee surgery, and the neighbor who sometimes watched Eli was on vacation in Florida. So Eli came with him. "Is this your building, Dad?" Eli asked as they pushed through the revolving door. "It's the hospital I started," Thomas said. "But is it yours?" Thomas thought about that for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It's mine." Eli looked up at the atrium ceiling, the light coming through the high windows. "It's big," he said. "I know." They crossed the lobby together. Thomas nodded to the security desk. The guard, a young man named Perry, who had been working the morning shift for about 4 months, looked up briefly, then back down at something on his screen. Thomas didn't stop. He knew the way to the boardroom. He had walked it hundreds of times. The boardroom was on the 3rd floor, glass-walled, facing the interior courtyard. It was room Thomas had specifically designed to be visible from the corridor. He believed in transparency, in the idea that leadership should not hide. He had said that in an interview once years ago, and meant it. He could see through the glass from down the hall. The room was already full. That struck him as strange before he understood why. The meeting was at 9. It was 8:47. Board members didn't arrive early. In his experience, board members arrived at 9:02 with coffee and apologies. But all 11 chairs were filled. He could see the back of Neville Strand's head. Neville was the CFO Thomas had hired away from a larger system 3 years ago. Steady and careful, and exactly the kind of man you wanted watching the numbers. Beside him, Sandra Price, the COO Thomas had appointed 8 months ago after the previous one retired. Around the table, the rest of the administrative leadership, the people Thomas had chosen, promoted, trusted. They were talking. No one was looking at the door. Thomas pushed it open. The conversation stopped in that particular way that conversations stop when they have been about something they shouldn't have been about. Not all at once. A stagger. First the people facing the door, then the ones who noticed their faces change. Neville turned last. His expression did something complicated before it settled. "Thomas," he said. "Didn't know we were starting early," Thomas said. He stepped in. Eli followed, still holding the dinosaur. "We were just going over some preliminary items." Neville's voice was careful. Too careful. Thomas had known Neville for 3 years and he recognized when the man was choosing words the way you chose steps crossing ice. "Who's this?" Sandra Price asked. She was looking at Eli. "My son," Thomas said. "School's closed. He'll sit quietly." There was a pause around the table that lasted a beat too long. Not the pause of people deciding whether a child in a board meeting was acceptable. The pause of people recalibrating. Thomas pulled out a chair at the head of the table, the chair that had always been his, and sat down. He set the portfolio in front of him. Eli climbed into the chair to his right, the chair usually occupied by the head of legal, who was apparently absent, and placed the dinosaur on the table. "All right," Thomas said. "What preliminary items?" No one answered immediately. Sandra Price looked at Neville. Neville looked at his folder. There are some operational questions we've been discussing, Neville said. Around the structure of the system going forward. What? Structure? Sustainability. Funding models. The free clinic is running at a significant deficit. Thomas knew the free clinic ran at a deficit. He had always known that. It ran at a deficit because it was never designed to turn a profit. It was designed to serve people who could not afford to be turned away. He had funded it personally for the first 2 years, and the rest came from a community grant program he had negotiated with the county. The clinic's been running at a deficit since it opened, Thomas said. That's not news. The question, Neville said carefully, is whether the model is scalable. It's not supposed to be scalable. It's supposed to serve the east side of Denton. Another pause. A different quality to this one. Thomas looked around the table slowly. He was good at reading rooms. He had learned that skill the same place he learned most things. Watching. Listening. Staying quiet until he understood what he was seeing. What he was seeing now was a group of people who had not expected him to sit down. Eli leaned over. "Daddy," he whispered, too loud, the way 7-year-olds whisper. Nobody's smiling. A few people looked at the boy. No one smiled. Thomas put his hand on Eli's shoulder lightly, and kept his eyes on the table. "I'd like to see what you were looking at before I walked in," he said. "Thomas, whatever documents you had open, I'd like to see them." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. Thomas had been in enough difficult meetings to know the difference between silence that was hesitation and silence that was resistance. This was the second kind. It was Sandra Price who finally slid a folder across the table. Not to Thomas, she pushed it toward the center, which was a choice. Thomas reached forward and took it. He opened it. The first page was a letter of intent. He read the heading twice. Then he read the body of the letter. The folder documented a proposed acquisition. Heron Capital Partners, a private equity group out of Atlanta, had submitted a letter of intent to acquire Calloway Regional Medical Center. The proposed purchase price was listed. The proposed operational changes were outlined on the pages that followed. Consolidation of specialty services, closure of the free clinic, transition to a for-profit billing model within 18 months of acquisition. The letter of intent was dated 11 days ago. Thomas set the folder down. He did not raise his voice. His father had raised his voice, often and loudly, and Thomas had spent his adult life deciding not to do that. "When were you planning to tell me about this?" he asked. "It's still in preliminary stages," Neville said. "An LOI is not preliminary." "Neville," Thomas said his name quietly. "An LOI with a proposed acquisition price and a signed operational framework from our COO is not preliminary. Walk me through the timeline." No one spoke. "Who initiated contact with Heron?" Still nothing. Then Sandra Price said, "There were exploratory conversations." Exploratory conversations that produced a signed letter of intent. "Thomas, the system is carrying debt. The construction loan on the new East Wing. I know about the construction loan. I signed it. The projections for the next 3 years are not strong. In the current environment." "I've seen the projections," Thomas said. "I see them every quarter. They're not strong." "You're right. That's why we've been in restructuring conversations with the county. That's why I've been in talks with the university health system about an affiliate agreement. None of which required selling the hospital to a private equity firm that will close the free clinic within a year and a half." Neville opened his mouth. Thomas held up one hand. "I'm not finished." The room waited. "I own 62% of this hospital. My name is on the founding documents, the operating agreement, and the charter. Any acquisition discussion that reaches the stage of a signed letter of intent without my knowledge and without my signature is not a preliminary conversation. It is a breach of fiduciary duty." Eli had stopped swinging his feet under the chair. He was watching his father with the focused, serious expression of a child who understands the tone of what is happening even when he doesn't understand the words. "Dad," he said softly. Thomas looked at him. "Are you okay?" Thomas looked at his son for a moment. 7 years old. Claire's eyes, his own stubbornness in the set of the jaw. He had been raising this boy alone for 3 years, and he had learned, slowly and badly and then gradually better, how to be two parents at once. Or at least how to try. I'm okay. He looked back at the table. I need everyone to stay here. I'll be back in 15 minutes. He left the folder on the table. He stood, picked up his portfolio, and walked out of the room with Eli beside him. In the hallway he crouched down to Eli's level. I need you to sit with Janet in the admin office for a little while, he said. Janet Ferris ran the third-floor administrative suite and had known Eli since he was 4, and had always kept a bowl of M&Ms on her desk that she maintained was for visiting vendors. Is something wrong? Eli asked. Something needs to be fixed, Thomas said. That's different. Eli nodded, slowly. Like when the garbage disposal broke and you had to take it apart. Exactly like that. Okay, Eli said. He paused. Can I bring the dinosaur? You can always bring the dinosaur. Thomas walked Eli to Janet's office, spoke to her quietly for 90 seconds, and then went to find his general counsel. Her name was Renata Voss, and she had been with the hospital since the second year of operation, recruited from a firm in Columbus, where she had spent a decade doing healthcare compliance work. She was 51 years old, meticulous, and had a gift for remaining calm in proportion to the severity of a situation. The worse things got, the quieter and more precise she became. Thomas had always found this quality enormously reassuring. She was at her desk when he knocked. He set the folder in front of her without speaking. She read the first page, then the second. By the fourth page her expression had shifted into the specific stillness that Thomas had come to associate with her identifying something serious. This is signed by Sandra, she said. I know. As SCO, she doesn't have acquisition authority. The operating agreement requires a supermajority of the ownership stake for any transaction above 10% of total system assets. I know the agreement. I wrote it. Renata looked at the signature on the letter. This would have required someone to represent to Heron that this was a valid LOI. Either they believed Sandra had authority she doesn't have, or someone told them she did. Can you pull the communication logs between this office and Heron Capital for the past 90 days? I can pull everything generated from hospital systems. Do that. He went back to the boardroom. The people inside had not moved. That struck him. In the 15 minutes he had been gone, no one had left. He took that as meaningful. Either they were waiting because they believed this was still manageable, or they were waiting because none of them wanted to be the first one out the door. He sat back down. I've asked Renata Voss to pull the communication records, he said. I want to be direct with you about what happens next. If those records show that this negotiation was conducted with my knowledge being deliberately withheld, that's not an operational disagreement. That's fraud, and I will treat it as fraud. Neville Strand's face had gone carefully neutral. That neutrality told Thomas more than an expression would have. I also want to be clear about something else, Thomas said. I understand why someone might look at this hospital's numbers and think the rational move is to sell. I understand the argument. I disagree with it fundamentally, but I understand it. What I cannot understand, what I am genuinely struggling to understand, is how 11 people in this room decided that the right way to handle that disagreement was to negotiate around me. He paused. I started this hospital because my wife spent the last 2 years of her life being transferred between facilities that treated her like a billing code. She was a kindergarten teacher. She coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings. She made the same pot of chicken soup every time anyone in our neighborhood got sick. She was not a billing code. His voice remained even. I built this place so that the next woman like her, the next person like her, would have somewhere to go where that wouldn't happen. That was the reason. That has always been the reason. And you want to hand it to a private equity group, whose first act will be to close the only free clinic on the east side of this city's. The room was completely still. Daddy built this for Mommy, Eli said. Everyone turned. He was standing in the doorway. Janet was behind him, mouthing an apology. Eli had apparently declined to stay in the admin office. Thomas looked at his son. Eli was looking at the people around the table with the direct, unself-conscious gaze of a child who had not yet learned to be indirect. He told me, Eli said. He said the hospital was for people like Mom. No one spoke. Thomas stood. Come here, buddy. Ely crossed the room and stood next to his father. Thomas put a hand on his son's shoulder. Here is what is going to happen, Thomas said to the room. Renata is pulling the communication records. By end of business today, I will have a complete picture of who knew what and when. I will be meeting with each of you individually. Anyone who participated in concealing this negotiation from me will be terminated, effective immediately, and I will be referring the matter to outside counsel to assess civil and criminal exposure. He paused. If there is anyone in this room who did not know this was happening, who was brought into this meeting this morning, without full knowledge of the LOI, I want to speak with you separately. My door is open. He picked up his portfolio. Meeting adjourned. The dinosaur tucked back under Eli's arm. In the hallway, Eli looked up. Dad, he said. What's an LOI? It's a document where someone says they want to buy something that isn't theirs to buy. Eli thought about this. That's not right. No, Thomas said. It isn't. What followed was not clean. Real things rarely are. Renata's review of the communication records took 4 days. What emerged was not simple treachery. It was something more banal, and in some ways worse. A slow accumulation of small decisions made by people who had convinced themselves they were being pragmatic. Neville Strand had made initial contact with Heron Capital 7 months ago, presenting himself as acting on behalf of the board in an exploratory capacity. Sandra Price had joined the discussions 3 months later, after Neville had shown her projections that, Thomas later determined, had been selectively constructed to make the hospital's position look more precarious than it was. 3 other members of the leadership team had known to varying degrees. 2 had not known at all and came to Thomas separately, as he had asked, within 48 hours of the meeting. The communication records also revealed something else. Heron Capital had been told by Neville that Thomas Hadley had stepped back from active involvement in the hospital's operations due to personal circumstances, and that the board was effectively functioning as the decision-making body. Heron had accepted this representation without verifying it. Their legal team, when contacted by Renata, became very quiet very quickly. The LOI was formally withdrawn by Heron Capital on day 6, accompanied by a letter that was careful not to admit anything directly, but was unmistakably the letter of an organization that had realized it had been given materially false information. Neville Strand and Sandra Price were terminated on day 7. The 3 others who had known were terminated the following week, after individual meetings with Thomas and outside counsel. The process was documented carefully, each step reviewed by Renata, because Thomas understood that the way you did something mattered as much as what you did. He did not enjoy any of it. He had hired Neville personally. He had flown to Columbus to persuade Sandra to take the COO role. He had believed in both of them, and that belief had not been entirely wrong. They were capable people who had made a terrible choice, but it was finished now, and he sat with the weight of that without trying to talk himself out of it. The free clinic stayed open. The county restructuring conversations, which had been proceeding slowly, accelerated once it became known, quietly, through the appropriate channels, that an acquisition attempt had been made and defeated. A university health system affiliation agreement was signed 4 months later. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a real one, built on terms that protected the mission Thomas had built the hospital around. On the morning the affiliation agreement was signed, Thomas picked Eli up from school early. Eli was suspicious. Early pickups were not a usual thing. Did something happen? Eli asked, climbing into the back seat. Something good happened, Thomas said. Like what? The hospital is going to be okay. Eli considered this. He was holding a drawing he'd made in art class, a large building with crayon windows and a flag on top, which Thomas recognized, with a tightening in his chest, as an attempt to draw Calloway Regional. I made this, Eli said, holding it up. It's your hospital. I put a flag on it because Mrs. Brennan said you can put a flag on important buildings. Thomas took the drawing and held it against the steering wheel and looked at it for a moment. Does it look right? Eli asked. Yeah, Thomas said. It looks exactly right. He drove them home through the east side of Denton, past the streets he had grown up on, past the corner where he and Claire had lived in a rental apartment for the first 4 years of their marriage, past the park, where Eli had learned to ride a bike last summer. The training wheels off after 40 minutes of stubborn trying, and then suddenly, unexpectedly, gone. Past the ordinary geography of a life that had been broken and rebuilt, and was not finished yet. The flag in Eli's drawing was red. Thomas didn't know why he'd chosen red. He didn't ask. Some things you just let be what they are.